So we are live now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Weekend Conversations by Eternal Quest. And we're in collaboration with the Ahmedabad Book Club. And this is going to be the last interview of the first month of 2021. And we're ending this month with a very special guest today. And we also have Dr. Virja Lakshmi with us today. Welcome, ma'am. Welcome, both of you. So, poetry and spirituality goes together. It is in the deepest sense of yourself where you find answers imposed by the soul. The question, who am I and what is the purpose of life on earth, has moved many writers. Today, we have a renowned poet and author, Arundhati Subramaniam. She is the award winning author of 12 books of poetry and prose. Widely translated and anthologized, her most recent volume of poems, Love Without a Story, published in 2019 by Westland Amazon in India and just out internationally with Blood X Books, has been described as a breathtaking and heartwarming book and as a book by a unique poet of our times in a league all by herself. Her previous book, When God is a Traveler, was the season choice of the Poetry Book Society, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. She is the recipient of various awards and fellowships, including the inaugural Khushwant Singh Prize, the Raza Award for Poetry, the Z Women's Award for Literature, the second Seppo Prize in Italy, the Z Indian Women Award for Literature, the Mystic Kalinga Award, and among others. She has written extensively on culture and spirituality and has worked over the years as a poetry editor, cultural curator, and critic. As prose writer, her books include the best selling biography of a contemporary mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life, and the Book of a Buddha. As editor, her most recent book is the Penguin Anthology of a Sacred Poetry, Eating God. We're so honored to have you, ma'am, and welcome on the Eternal Quest.
Thank you so much, Dhriti. Thank you.
So, first of all, ma'am, could you let us know about your literary journey?
My literary journey.
Yes.
Where does one begin, Dhriti? It started a very long time ago, at least in terms of a literary journey that, well, what I thought was a literary journey when I was very young and excited about poems and felt the need to simply compose what I thought were poems and which weren't poems at all. So that's what I was doing for much of my, much of the time when I was in single digits and in my teens, writing a lot of stuff which I thought were poems and which definitely weren't. And it was later, though, I think this was around my late teens and 20s, through my entire 20s, that I realized that poetry gave me something that no other form did. It excited me in a particular way. So although it was not the most fashionable form to be espousing at the time, we're talking about the late 80s and the 90s in India when the novel was doing wonderfully and no one was really interested in poetry, or most people believed there wasn't much poetry happening. But that was actually the time when I was writing and writing quite intensely. And it helped to have a writer's circle in Mumbai at that time called the Poetry Circle. And there was a sense of community, which was very important. But it was much later, Dhriti, probably when, I think it was 2001 that my first book of poems actually came out. And it felt like a very long wait. But looking back, I think it was absolutely right. I'm very glad I waited as long as I did. I'm very glad publishers were few and far between, and that the publisher who actually materialized didn't materialize till 2001. I'm glad for all that because it gave me time to actually marinate in my poetry, to take it seriously as a craft, to not simply believe that I had arrived because I had some dexterity with language, which many people have. So it gave me a chance to really work strenuously on my form. And I'm grateful for that. And then, of course,
Lovely.
since Viti, there's been a lot of poetry as well as a fair
Yeah.
amount of prose. Yeah.
Yes. So, talking about Love with a Story, which
With
has been your recent poetry collection.
love
So,
without,
could you tell us?
love without a story. Love without a story. Not
Yeah,
love with a
Love
story.
Without a Story. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. So, Love
Oh.
Without a Story has been your recent poetry collection. So, could you tell us about the various themes that have been portrayed in the book?
Well, the usual, as soon as one uses the word love, I think the immediate association is, a story, love story. In fact, that was something you very naturally brought up in your phrase, right? Love with a story is what we would customarily believe um, any writing on love would be about. But I was curious. I think what was curious actually for me, when I looked back on these poems that had accumulated over the past 5 years, what interested me is the fact that they were circling a certain set of themes: conversation, intimacy, love. But not the gooey, sentimental kind of romantic love that many of us associate with perhaps those very useful things called Archie's greeting card verse. Um, Poems. It's not that kind of stuff. But it is. There are romantic poems in there. I'm not averse to romantic poems. They are there. But what I think the book is really about is um, looking at love, but with a certain expansive gaze. So it's about listening, actually. I think to me, the book is very fundamentally about listening. And I see listening as an act of love, really. The willingness to give space to another person, another opinion, another idea, another worldview. The willingness to just give space and to honor the other by the simple act of attention. To me, that's what love really is. It's an amplitude of vision. It's a gaze that is willing to include more than it leaves out. To me, that's the kind of love that interests me here. It's affectionate, it's not without humor, but there is a willingness to be surprised, a willingness to be persuaded. And I feel more and more, Dviti, that particularly in the world that we live in, which is so fractured, uh, where opinions seem so polarized and so inherently adversarial and antagonistic, almost as if it's impossible for any healing or resolution to take place. I feel particularly in a world like that, what poetry can actually remind us of is that there are deeper levels of kinship, much deeper than uh,
Yes.
than we might suppose. And words in a poem for me are a way of pointing to those deeper levels of kinship, which actually go beyond language, you know, or at least language as we know it.
Yes, yes. And that's very beautiful thing that you said. Love is about giving space and honoring the person. And that's a really beautiful definition, ma'am. Thank you so much. So, could you let us know what was the reason behind the title When God is a Traveler?
The last book of poems. Uh,
Yes.
Actually, that's a title that came from a poem in the book, and that became the title
Okay.
poem.
Uh-huh.
What is that poem about? It's actually, on the one hand, Viti, my life is one of travel. My life is certainly, I see myself as a seeker, so in many ways, it's one of quest, very fundamentally. And so perhaps it wasn't surprising that I started thinking about this particular figure, which all of us in India are familiar with, the son of Shiva, with whom I happen to actually share a name. Subramaniam is one of the names of Karthikeya or Muruga. So I started actually sitting down one day and thinking about my name and what resonances that had for me, if at all it had any. And it was this story that came to mind, this story of Karthikeya flying into a rage. Basically, his father, I don't know, you know the story, I'm sure many of you, but since we have the time, I'm going to tell you a very short story or remind you of one that you've always known, but have perhaps not heard in a while. It's the moment when Shiva holds out the fruit of knowledge to his sons, and both of them want it. And Shiva says, well, the one who runs a race, the one who travels the world and returns first, will get the fruit. So Karthikeya, Subramania, my namesake, leaps onto his peacock and takes off on this journey around the world. I'm not sure how long it takes to complete that kind of journey on a peacock. I suspect it will take a while. Maybe he's still on that journey. No, no, he isn't. But Ganapati, the wiser son, at that moment at least, simply circles his parents and says, "You are my world." And that's the right answer, and he gets the fruit, and all ends well. But this more literal God, this more impetuous God, travels the world. And he returns, we are told, a long time later, and he flies into a rage when he finds that his fruit has been eaten. There's probably a very smug-looking Ganesha sitting on his parents' lap. And I can understand his rage. And then Shiva tells him, but you are the fruit. So it's always struck me as unfair, Dviti. I always felt, why couldn't Shiva have told him this at the start? You know, the answers to be found within you. Why did one have to make this journey? Why did this poor boy have to make this journey? But it took me time to realize that some journeys do have to be made for us to actually hear a truth. The truth can be around all the time, and one can miss it all the time and again, one can miss it. So for something to turn from inherited wisdom into living experience often means a journey has to be made. And I like to believe that Karthikeya, whom I see as an alter ego in this poem, is all the richer for that journey. It's a journey of experience, it's a journey of adventure, perhaps it's a journey of failure too, on occasion. But it's a journey that I'm sure he was deeply enriched by. And I believe he needed to make that journey.
Yes, that's true, ma'am. And this is a story which everyone will be knowing and everyone would have heard in their childhood, and we've learned a lot from this story.
And I should also say here, Riti, that in doing this, actually Karthikeya is reenacting a story that we hear in so many forms in world mythology. You know, the prodigal son, you have it in the Odyssey, the idea of the quest, and the idea that in some way your answers are to be found exactly where you started. But it's something that you don't really completely understand or recognize until you make the journey. And the journey, of course, transforms you, and the journey transforms the way you look at your notion of home. But it has to be made.
Yes. So it's actually like when one makes that journey, that's when the time that that person realizes that it was where he began from. He had to come exactly where he began from, and the answers were there itself. But the journey is important because the journey gives all the answers and the lessons and the experiences, which are really beautiful.
The journey, I think, chips off those bits of you that are actually superfluous, those bits of you that you acquired and could very easily relinquish. And it allows you to see, I think, afresh, to see something afresh and to recognize it for what it really is.
Yeah, we could also say that that journey, really wipes off all the layers that we have, and it just like puts out a true image of our own self in front of us, which is really what one needs in their lives sometimes. So yes. So next one is my favorite, and I would like to know what was your experience working with Sadhguru and the journey of writing the best-selling biography of Sadhguru More Than a Life. I am really excited to know this.
Have you read the book?
No, not like I've not read it completely, but I do know the gist about the book. So yeah.
I hope you will read it sometime. It was
No, I will. That's on my wish list. I will.
Okay. It was a strange book, Dviti, talking of journeys. That was a roller coaster journey, really. And I think what was important to me during that book is the fact that, well, it started in 2006. I had already met Sadhguru a couple of years before that. And I remember we were on a walk when, I happened to tell him that there wasn't enough material about his life at that time available. And I remember he said at that time, then why don't you write it? And I agreed with great alacrity at the time, but it was perhaps a bit foolish because I had a very dim, sense at that time, a very dim inkling of what it might actually entail, and it entailed a great deal. It entailed. I'm sorry. Is there a problem with the sound? It's clear.
No, yeah, yes, it's clear, ma'am.
Yeah.
It's clear. Yes.
So it became a 4-year-long journey, Dhriti, and the book finally happened in 2010. And it entailed long conversations with Sadhguru, and it also entailed reading, drawing material from the Isha archives. So I was spending a long time in the ashram itself, and there were many crises of faith along the way. Many moments when I thought I would never be able to get this right, because I was very clear at that time about one thing, that I didn't want it to be. It wasn't for me. I was not interested in writing a scam or an expose. Not that there was one to be written, but that was not my orientation at all. At the same time, I didn't want to write just a deeply, uncritically adoring biography. That was not. I was not going to be writing as a groupie. I didn't want it to be that either. So it was somewhere between the two that I wanted to find a tone that was respectful, very deeply respectful, and at the same time a tone of inquiry. And I like to believe that that happened eventually, but it took me time to find it. It really took me time to find it. There were many times when I gave up altogether. But eventually, I think it was around 2010 at some point when Sadhguru told me, he sent me an email saying, is this going to be a posthumous biography? And then that was the time I had actually given up on it. And so I decided to go back again, look at it. And the pace accelerated, and it was done by the end of the year. So it was exciting. He's an unpredictable figure to be around, and it was great fun, and it was great. It was challenging, all of it, all together, because there is this person who's very, as you know, very accessible, funny, easy to be with. There's also the guru figure who is remote, formidable in many ways. There is the Sadhguru with whom I argue a fair amount. There's that. So there are all these facets to the person, which made it an exciting journey.
Yeah. Wonderful, ma'am. So glad to hear this. And what is that one idea which transformed your life while composing the Book of Buddha?
The Book of Buddha.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked that, because it's a while since I've talked about that book, actually. I think, Lakshmi, it was the fact that, let me say what really drew me to it, to start that project in the first place.
Yes,
I think I've always been fascinated by the quester figure. You got a sense of that when I was talking about the Karthikeya, mythological figure. But yes, the Buddha is one of the most inspiring quester figures we know, isn't it? I mean, he's, for one, an amateur. He's not a professional. He doesn't come from the caste and the social background that is considered to be appropriate for the life of mendicancy that he chooses to lead. He's not from that background. He comes from a privileged background. He should be tending to his lands and, perhaps leading a life of some comfort, which he chooses not to do. So if you were to look at it in purely material terms, it is in fact a riches to rags story, materially, which becomes, of course, a rags to riches story spiritually, and in terms of the bequest to the world centuries later. It's an extraordinary spiritual inheritance to leave behind. And then there's the fact that he is, as I said, an amateur. He is an unlicensed quester. He tells us that it is possible for every one of us to have these questions and to act on them. That we don't have to be card-carrying members of some spiritual club to be asking these questions. And I think most inspirational of all is the fact that this is a man who actually staked his life on those questions. He didn't turn away. For me, time and again, that is what inspires me about the figure of Siddhartha Gautama. the fact that he doesn't turn away. He could very easily not have been a success, like so many others. But we remember him because he didn't flinch and because he came back to tell us that those questions are worth asking. That we're not strange, we are not misfits, we are not oddballs to be asking those questions. But he also tells us that it takes commitment to stay with those questions and not to look away.
Yeah, true, ma'am. Like, life is somewhere about not giving up your hope, not giving up your dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to know what is the idea of spirituality according to you? Is it that you address the most essential question, who am I? Or what is the purpose of life on earth? Or something beyond this life, or something what you call as transcendental? So we would like to hear from you.
Mm. Yes, I think the who am I questions, I think all of us have at some point. What's it all about? What is this? I think this is again one of the reasons why the iconic story of the Buddha appeals to all of us, right? He seems to have been deeply troubled by questions that we've all remembered being troubled by at some point. Pain. Why human pain? And what about loss? The kind of loss that we can't make any sense of, and which cannot be explained away by all the platitudes that people around us seem to recycle time and again. How does one deal with pain? How does one deal with loss? How does one deal with beginnings and endings, births and deaths? And what is all this about? I think it's that acknowledgement of mystery, really, that on some level fueled my own journey. But I also will say this, that there was a time when, and I must say, coming back to your who am I question, I have a poem from the time that I was 10 or 11, which was really a who am I poem. Which part of me is me? Essentially me. Which part of me can I do without? Those were the questions that were part of that poem. Many years later, Vijayalakshmi, I think I realized, certainly I realized this in the course of my own journey, when the questions intensified, the spiritual journey became very consciously a part of my life. But I remember reading Joseph Campbell, the wonderful writer and mythologist, and he says in one of his interviews, he says that it's not really the meaning of life that one seeks, though one often believes that is primarily the driving force behind the quester's life. He says, it's not really the meaning of life that I was seeking. It is a deeper and more heightened experience of life itself. And that rang very true, because I realized somewhere along the way that, the meaning was not going to come to me in a neat set of words, that the meaning, in fact, if at all, was going to come from elsewhere, and it may entail relinquishing, abandoning my idea of meaning altogether. It might actually entail confronting, inhabiting a level of what would conventionally be called meaninglessness, but which may not be meaningless as in useless, but a sense of a world evacuated of all conferred meaning. And to confront that, which often seems like a confrontation with vacancy, with emptiness, can be terrifying. So I think my journey took on a certain intensity and urgency when I realized that it entailed confronting those places that I'd rather not go to, because it is a confrontation with emptiness as well. How we eventually make our peace with that emptiness, whether we see it as empty or we see it as full. I'm not going to get into a philosophical debate, but I think it has really been about trying to understand what this something more is. And even the word thing is, of course, a misnomer here. But I think many of us have, all of us, every human being has had this sense at some point that there has to be something more. What is this more? And the quest for that more, which can seem to be beyond, can sometimes seem to be within, whatever that more is, which seems to make us more than just this wonderful drama. Our lives are this great drama of materiality, but there seems to be something more. What is that something more? I think that's where my spiritual journey began. Acknowledging that there is more, but not denying that we are also exactly this, the glorious world of messy materiality. That's also who we are. But there is the sense of mystery of that
Yeah.
more, and about trying to tune in to what that might be.
So life is a sort of mixture and we are somewhere caught between 0 and 1. So by 0, we also mean shunya or nothingness. And ma'am, we want to hear from you, which is more important, the mind, body, heart, or the soul in one's life? So from your recent collection of...
You should go and listen to a spiritual master talk if you wanted that. But let me say this. It actually took me time, Vijay Lakshmi, to realize that I didn't have to choose. For a long time, I think I tied myself into knots because I felt I had to either be this or that. And it took me forever to realize something that is very simple and very basic, and which I ought to have realized a long time ago, but didn't. And that is the fact that we are both matter and spirit, and we don't have to choose. We are both. And yes, we are caught, as to use your phrase, we sometimes seem to be caught between one and the other. But I had a cycle of poems in my previous book, When God is a Traveler, which is about the figure Shakuntala. And I started by seeing this figure as caught, to use your phrase again, caught between samsara and nirvana, caught between earth and sky, caught between matter and spirit, until I realized that she's not caught at all between court and hermitage, however you want to see these polarities. I realized that it is possible to see her as a bridge between these worlds. And that is the incredible possibility that I believe human beings are born with. We can be this bridge between matter and spirit because that's who we are. In acknowledging both, we actually acknowledge what tremendous possibilities we are. So in my most recent book, I have a poem called Mitti, where I speak of the role of the poet as one of a messenger between moon and mud. And it is for me a celebration, really, of that kind of conduit, that kind of hyphen that we all are between flesh and spirit, between all the worlds that we are encouraged to believe are binaries that can never meet, but which do in fact meet. And they meet because of us, because we've experienced both. That's how they meet.
Yes. So, Eating God, the title itself seems very interesting. So, can you inspire us with the idea of what you call as sacred poetry, which is mentioned in the book Eating God?
Eating God is an anthology of bhakti poetry, actually, Vijay Lakshmi. It's bhakti poetry. Bhakti, as you know, is devotion. And I had grown up reading some of these poems or hearing them and believing that bhakti just meant a kind of easy, servile, hierarchical relationship with God, just groveling and saying, please listen to my prayer, a kind of petition to God. That's how I looked at bhakti poetry. Until my own journey started taking on, as I said, a certain, it started intensifying. And then I reclaimed many of these poems for myself, and they came alive to me in a way they never had earlier. And I began to realize just how ferocious they are. There's nothing tame about bhakti poetry. It's not antiseptic, goody-goody poetry to God. It's a wild, passionate, erotic, argumentative relationship with God that these poems talk about. And therefore, it was very intensely familiar. It's about the emotional landscape that I was very familiar with, which is about doubt. It's about yearning. It's about rage. It's about appetites of all kinds, inconvenient appetites, embarrassing instincts, impulses that we would rather wish away. But the bhakti poets remind us that by acknowledging all of that, we can actually be in some integral way transformed. So I think for those of us who feel that, that spirituality is about turning into some kind of placid, tranquil entity, the bhakti poets are a wonderfully refreshing antidote. They remind us that if you do want to actually be on a path of some authenticity, it entails acknowledging all these crevices of yourself, of your inner life, of your emotional landscape that you may be unwilling really to acknowledge, but which are an integral part of who you are. So it's by acknowledging them that they transform them. I think that to me is the wonderful thing about the Bhakti poets. So I'd say for anyone who loves poetry, that's a book to turn to because it has every conceivable emotional tone and tenor. And for those of us who have a spiritual thirst or who see ourselves as seekers in some way, I'd say turn to those poems because they remind you that being spiritual is not antithetical to being deeply human. These are deeply human poems. Therefore, eating God, the most base appetite, the need to eat, and God, the most sublime. We were talking about bridges earlier. This is the kind of poem that they bring to us, where you can eat and tuck into a good meal of God. That's what Janabai says in a poem that I've always loved. She says, I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here. God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within. God is without. And what's more, there's God to spare. That's a beautiful translation by Arun Koletkar, and it's one of my favorite poems.
Yeah, I'm really touched and inspired by your words, ma'am. So, do you believe that form is really important for poetry?
Form? Did you say form?
Yeah,
Yes,
form.
I don't think there can be a poem without form, Vijayalakshmi. And if you mean attention to form and to craft, I'd say absolutely. I think it's. I'm certainly not one of those who sees craft as a dirty word. You know, the act of rolling up your sleeves and getting down to the business of crafting a poem, that's an integral part of the making of a poem. You know, many people speak only of inspiration as if it can happen divorced from form, and it can't. Most of the time, the starting point for a poem is often a verbal image, and you start building that image. It's an act of making, it's an act of artisanal activity. So I'm all for attention to form. To my mind, that's hugely important. But form doesn't have to mean a fixed form. You know, it doesn't have to mean writing in a sonnet or a ghazal or a villanelle. It doesn't have to mean that. You could be using free verse and still be someone who regards form as hugely important. You know, even in free verse, rigor is hugely important. You know exactly why you end the line where you end. You know exactly why you pause where you pause. At least every poet who's trying to craft a conscious utterance ought to be aware of this. So I'd say any art form is about freedom and form, and the two go together. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So, ma'am, do you think that happiness is more than success in the process of life?
It's more than success. Well, I think we all want success, but absolutely, you know, to go back to that earlier metaphor of Karthikeya on his journey around the world, you think he didn't want that fruit at the very start? Of course, he wanted it. Did it come to him at the very start? No. He took off on that journey. And I like to believe, as I said earlier, that he needed to make that journey. I also believe that there were pleasures on that journey, you know, that there was sensual delight, that there was discovery, that there was deep engagement, that there was some heartbreak, maybe. I don't know. But all of that was part of that journey. I like to believe that. And I believe that those journeys add to the texture of our lives. So it's not just a cliche, you know, this business about, oh, the journey being as important as the destination. If we think through some of these stories, we know that that is true. There are just so many things that parents could have told us when we were, well, perhaps did tell us when we were age 10 or age 8 or age 17. You know, all the things that they told us, which you're probably telling your kids now, or maybe you're not. All I mean is that despite all that they told us, we needed to make some journeys. We needed to make some discoveries so that they could be our discoveries and not secondhand wisdom. So, yes, I do believe the journey is hugely important. I also believe that going back to what you said earlier about form and freedom, and about inspiration and perspiration, the two go together. So it's not like there's one magical moment of discovery and the rest of the time is just labor and penance. It's not like that. What we call labor and penance is the journey, is the process. Often the act of making a poem, which might take you a few days, it might take you a couple of years, that journey is so exciting. Yes, it's wonderful if at the end of it someone tells you that they've enjoyed it. But would you give away those hours of actually crafting and chiseling and living in a workshop of language, which is full of the heat and dust of word shavings all around you? Would you give that up? No. I think anyone who's loved a form knows that the process is exhilarating. And you won't give it up for anything.
Yes, indeed, ma'am.
Someone who asked about rhyme. So,
yes. Vishal said that he wants to know that how important rhyming in the poem, and could we make a poem without rhyming the words?
Yes, it's a question from Harshil. Thank you for your question, Harshil. I'd say exactly what I said now, which is that there's free verse. Free verse doesn't use rhyme necessarily. It may use it at times, it may drop it entirely. And yes, a lot of poetry does not use rhyme at all and does not use meter at all. You can use meter and not use rhyme, that's blank verse. But there's poetry that dispenses with it all and is still poetry. How do we know that it is a poem? I'd say that something is a poem when it is a cohesive verbal entity that draws you not just because of what it is saying, but because of how it is saying it. You may not necessarily understand at the start the guile, the craft, the cunning of a poem, and why it is that you feel compelled to pause and to listen. You may not understand what's going on right away. But when you do, you often find that there are certain verbal resources being used by the poet. They're very consciously used. Rhythm is one. Sometimes fracturing rhythm is also a way to create a poem. So you build up an expectation and then you shatter it. That's also part of the craft of a poem. It can be tone. Tone is an important verbal resource. When do you raise your voice? When do you drop it? Sometimes dropping your voice can be a wonderful way to be heard. Sometimes whispering is the best way to be heard. So there are all kinds of verbal resources being used. The image is another resource. So the haiku poem, for instance, the haiku often offers you just a single image. One of my favorite haikus is the Basho haiku, which goes, old pond, leap splash, a frog. It's just an image. Old pond, leap splash, a frog. Certainly no rhyme in there, at least not in our English translation for sure. But it works as a poem because it's a vivid image. And it's an image that shatters our idea of cause and effect. It became for the poet a kind of awakening, a spiritual awakening. And I think this is just a start. We can have a much longer conversation about this, but it's a start. I think it's important to start sharpening your awareness of what could be the various verbal resources adopted by poetry. And it doesn't have to be rhyme.
Wonderful, ma'am. So thank you, Harshal, for your question, and we hope you've been guided properly by ma'am. And thank you, ma'am, for the answer. So I would like to know that does the question, who am I, sometimes trouble you while leading the voyage of ultimate truth?
I think we've talked about this, Viti, haven't we? We've talked about it. I told you I actually wrote a poem about who am I and all of that. And I told you for me it's become far more important to acknowledge that there is much more to life than these, that these are not cerebral questions, that these have to become questions of the gut. If
Yes.
they're just cerebral questions, we can have endless dinner parties talking about them. But when they become a question that kind of corrodes your innards, then they're not even about who am I, they're just about, I need a way, I need a path. And when that path comes, you are as grateful as you can possibly be. That path will not give you a verbal answer every morning. It's not like your cell phone that gives you a thought for the day kind of thing. It's not that. It is really about making your peace with the nonverbal. It is about making your peace with silences. I often say, I try to remind people that one of the reasons we turn to poetry is not for meaning. Look at it closely. If you just wanted meaning in your life, you would read the newspaper. It's crammed with meaning from beginning to end. And in this kind of newsprint, we have to strain to actually read what's going on. It's full of meaning. Is meaning all that we want? Look at a page of poetry, much of which is just emptiness, blank space. What is that about? Is that just because the poet didn't know how to fill up paper? Is it just because the poet ran short of words or doesn't have the vocabulary that you do? What is it that makes it so important for us on some level as readers and as listeners? What is it about these silences that are so important? It's when those questions derailed my life at one point, really derailed my life. When it meant a confrontation with silence in a way that terrified me. Uh, that's when I think I began to realize gradually that the real question is, where are these words coming from? Where do these forms emerge from? Where do these questions arise from? And when you start making your peace with those spaces from where things arise in the first place, I think you can say that your spiritual journey is beginning to unfold. So it's really not about receiving answers to the questions, and this has often been said. It's really about watching some questions drop away. I think to me
Yeah.
that becomes far more significant.
So, being a cultural curator and a poetry editor, uh, what was your experience writing about culture and being an editor for poetry, and then being the best-selling author? So, what was and winning lot of awards? So, what was all this experience put together? Yeah.
That's a tough one to answer, Vijay. What I will say is that poetry for me has always been the center of my life. So I built my entire life around it in terms of a livelihood. So I was excited about dance and theater and music and performing arts, really. So I started writing on the performing arts because I needed to make a living. And also because it gave me great pleasure to hang around theaters and stages and green rooms, and my conversations with dancers and um, actors has been a very integral, enriching part of my life. So that was how it started. But somewhere along the way, I realized that my poetry is deeply nourished by my work as a cultural commentator. So all the writing that I was doing on dance and theater and literature was actually feeding into my own poetry in a very significant way. And later, as editor of the Poetry International web, I had the chance to listen to poets from all over the country, speaking in different languages, commissioning translations. That was a huge honor, really, to be able to listen, to tune into all this. So I just saw this as part of a journey that enriched my poetic practice and enriched who I was. But much later, I think I began to realize that, I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am. Please
Yeah.
continue.
So
Yeah.
I think much
Yeah.
later I began to also realize that all these seemingly disparate activities in my life were deeply connected. So my understanding later, when yoga became important to my life and meditation became important, I think I realized many of the metaphors that had become important already to me, thanks to my um, preoccupation with dance and with physical, with hatha yoga, many of those metaphors that were important to me, even in my practice as a poet, those were hugely helpful in navigating the spiritual journey as well. So I feel they're all much more connected than I often have realized.
And ma'am, what are your future plans?
My future plans are to read a lot and to some kind of unlicensed reading, hopefully. And reading a lot of, I've been reading a lot around women mystics, mystic poetry. So I hope to deepen some of that and see where that goes.
And any message to the audience and readers out there
I don't know
that you would like to give?
if
Yeah.
all the messages in the poetry, if at all there is one. So I'd
Yeah.
say read, I hope some of you will actually buy some of the books of poetry, because if there's any form that needs your active support, it is poetry. It's amazing how poetry works wonderfully at lit fests, because poets are able to, read their work out loud, and it has an immediate impact. But despite all that, despite the fact that each one of us has written a poem at some point in our lives, not every one of us has written a novel, all of us have written poems. Despite that, think back on how many books of poetry you've actually bought. And I'd say to you that if you can count even one in the past 5 years, I'd say wonderful, go out and buy another. And if you haven't bought any, I'd say this is the time to make a beginning. The poetry can actually be a very deep ally in your life. It can become many poets whom I've grown up with and whom I'd forgotten and have reclaimed have been my friends. They've become voices in my head that are voices of my heart, really. And they've become allies. They've become companions on a journey that can otherwise sometimes seem terrifyingly lonely. So remember your
Yeah.
early excitement about poems and go out there and buy a book, is what I'd say.
Yeah. So we have one question from the audience, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
I think he meant, is life a poem of mystery?
Ah, yes, Jose. Yes, thank you for your question. Um, it's a good question. And that's a bit of a poem in itself, isn't it? Yes, I'd say yes. I remember this beautiful line from that struck me when I read it years ago. It's Saint Francis of Assisi, the biography of Saint Francis by G.K. Chesterton, where he says that Saint Francis was a poet whose whole life was a poem. And your question comes back to that, really. There is, that is, I think, ultimately what I think every poet hopes to, in some way, aspire to, but which is in some ways what perhaps every seeker wants as well, an acknowledgement of a life devoted to acknowledging and perhaps even celebrating mystery, a life that makes room for wonder, that isn't just looking for certainties, that isn't just looking to be clever. There are so many ways in which the world pats us on the back for knowing the right answer in class. You know that feeling of being the clever kid who knew the right answer. But the joy and the deep fulfillment that can come from acknowledging mystery and embracing mystery, um, that to me is the beginning of a poem and a life that could be a poem.
So we have one more question from the audience. Um, any message for a beginner writer? I mean, he meant budding writers.
Yes, of course. Harshil, I'd say three things. One is keep writing. Don't believe all the naysayers who tell you that it's not worth doing. It's worth doing, particularly if you're writing poetry. You may not find many people validating that worth, but if you're excited about it, do it. Don't listen to all the voices that say no, and that can be deeply discouraging and disheartening. Put those away. The second thing I'd say to you is read. It's amazing how many writers, young writers, don't read. You cannot be a writer if you're not a reader. It's very important. I am always amazed at how many people tell me they write poetry, but have never read any, haven't bought a single book of poems in their lives. You cannot be a poet. You cannot be a writer of any kind if you're not a passionate, omnivorous, first and foremost. And the third thing I'd say to you is don't be in a hurry to arrive as a writer. As I told you, I was very glad I waited for a very long time before publishing my first book. You may have opportunities to publish, but that doesn't make you a writer. Just having a book doesn't make you a writer. You become a writer when you're able to understand the imperatives of your form, your craft, when you understand why you've made the formal choices you have, and when you find a voice that you feel is recognizably your own. All of that becomes part of the journey of being a writer. So I'd say enjoy the journey. Don't be in a hurry to arrive at some mythic destination.
So, thank you very much, ma'am. It was indeed an honor, and you were truly inspirational, and it was very lovely having you on our show. Thank
Thank
you
you.
once again, ma'am.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
your
much,
introduction.
ma'am.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so
Vicky.
much. It was lovely
Thank you so
having
much.
This talk. I really enjoyed it too, very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you back with another episode of the Weekend Conversations by the Eternal Quest, and in collaboration with the Ahmedabad Book Club. Thank you so much for all the lovely comments that we've received, and all the questions, and all the love and support. Thank you.